Welcome to Pirate Politics, where we prepare for your next political conversation. I'm Jeronimo Cortina, a political science professor at the University of Houston.
And I'm Brandon Rottinghaus, also a political science professor here at the University of Houston. Thanks for hanging out with us and talking some politics. We normally, of course, cover the issues of the week and talk about all things current. But this week, we're going to take a step back and talk about a broad issue that is definitely important to politics in a modern sense, that is not just a U.S. phenomenon, but an international phenomenon, and that's political scandals. There is this line of thinking that suggests that scandals simply don't matter anymore. I'm working on a book project that basically documents much of this, but look at the evidence, Jeronimo.
Okay.
We have effectively many members of Congress who have survived scandals. Some of them, they've retired or resigned, but they've held off in office for longer than we would have expected. We have people like Donald Trump serving as president who has 34 indictment counts against him.
Sure.
Still reelected president. The public totally knew this. This is not like a surprise. Lauren Boebert is still in Congress despite many scandals. Andrew Cuomo running for governor, running for mayor of New York after being disgraced as governor. Bill Clinton, right? A former president, also survived his scandal. So I guess my kind of first pitch question to you is like, do scandals still matter?
No. Next question, please, dear sir. No, and they don't matter because I think it has to do with the phenomenon given the 24/7 news cycle. That it gets old. Right. And then something else comes up. So the lifespan of a scandal is very, very limited.
Very short, The why question is the one that's the most pertinent, right? There are sort of a lot of cases that one could make that suggest that these scandals are not as impactful as they used to be. And in my work, I don't make the case that scandals don't matter because they still do. There are still serious consequences to them, but there aren't as many consequences as there used to be. So for instance, looking at the survival rates of politicians from the 70s to the present, the best time to be in office for a member of Congress was in the 1980s. Your survival rates were much higher than they were before that. During the Watergate era, voters are going to kick you out or you were going to resign. Beginning in the 90s, really, people who were in the executive branch, especially presidents, were surviving more than they were in prior years. So there's a lot of kind of institutional differences. There's lots of sort of time differences. One time difference people point to is the question about shame. And so there's this kind of idea that basically politicians don't have the same shame reflex that they used to. That back in the day, in order to avoid embarrassment to you and to your family, you would like resign if something awful happened in your professional life. But now people don't. They stay in. George Santos is a great example of this, right? He, of course, resigned from Congress, but he held in for a much longer period than you would have ever expected. And there were like hundreds of things that he did wrong, lies he told and half-truths that were apparent. And so he was able to kind of just work through all these things in a way that like most politicians in the prior era wouldn't be. So what gives? Like what happened to shame as the nature of political elements?
When you contrast that, for example, with the political scandals in Europe, there is a clear separation between engaging in a scandalous act, while you're in office with government business, and then kind of personal life scandals, Like the French don't give a damn if, the minister of whatever has 3 lovers, so they don't care, right? So like,
That wouldn't fly here though, probably, although it's unclear actually.
There's different measurements for shame, and there's also different measurements in terms of how people may have that quote-unquote empathy for the person that is doing the scandalous act.
Interesting.
And obviously, the fact that we have social media, the fact that we have that, I think that it adds a little bit more of context to this to the situation, giving or allowing people to be closer to the context and say, well, you know,
Understood.
that could happen to me as well.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's fine. It's the land of second chances. Sure, why
That's
not?
fascinating. Yeah, there is this sort of question about, if like apologies work and do people believe them?
Exactly.
And if so, then redemption is a key part of
Exactly.
how politicians are able to kind of wiggle out of some of these scandals. That's really interesting. For a fairly religious nation, the public's willing to put up with a lot, right? It seems. Although, of course, a lot of this is shaped by, you guessed it, partisanship, right?
Yep.
Partisan politics basically has been the shield for a lot of politicians who've been able to protect themselves against these kinds of moments. Politicians are likely to survive in office when they've got more of support in the institution that they're in. So for members of Congress, if they've got more of their fellow compatriots, partisans in office with them, they won't vote to get rid of them, right? Won't vote to expel them. If you're a president or if you're somebody who can be impeached, if you've got more partisans in that chamber that would otherwise impeach you, then you're not likely to be impeached. So your survival is directly dependent on partisanship. But it's not just about the institutions. It's also about the voters, right? Because they don't hold the politicians accountable the way that they used to. And a lot of scholarship suggests basically that scandals simply aren't deal breakers anymore. People don't care as much about the scandal as they care about how ideologically proximate a person is to that individual. So that is another kind of major problem that partisanship creates. And, in a few minutes, I'll talk about the implications to scandals not mattering, because if we lose those, then there's serious accountability problems. But for sure, one of the big drawbacks, one of the big implications to partisanship and rising polarization is that you simply have a moment where people don't hold their own politicians accountable, but they're very likely to hold the opposition party accountable. And that's a major flaw in the system. So how do voters think about this? And a scandal just like one more kind of negotiable, one more element of how people think about voting. Like, how do you stand on abortion? Where are you on healthcare issues? And whether or not you've had, the sort of, some kind of scandalous dealings in your past.
Well, I think, the fact of the matter is that partisanship has become a mega identity.
Yeah.
It's not just an identity.
Yes.
It's a mega identity that you filter everything through that, I guess.
That lens. Yeah.
That lens, right? So what you want to do is to avoid this cognitive dissonance, right? And what you want to avoid is like, well, he's a Republican or he's a Democrat.
Yeah.
They did X, Y, or Z, but I'm also a Democrat or I'm also a Republican.
Yeah.
I have to side and stay with the team.
Yes.
So that fact that partisanship, given polarization, has become this mega identity is extremely dangerous, because objectivity in terms of these things, what constitutes a good public servant, a good politician, or whatnot, or what are the, I guess, as Speaker Johnson said the other week during President's, speech to the joint session, is there is no decorum anymore, right? So, whatever that means.
We're all just yelling at each other.
Exactly.
And it's just government by sniping. Yeah.
So when you have that lens, right, the
kaleidoscope. Yeah,
yes, thank
that's
you.
Good. Yeah.
Yeah,
I like that. It's very illustrative.
Yes, you shift it, right, and you see a different picture, different colors. So partisanship is doing that.
Well, and I think you make a great point about the way that people see things and the lens through which they see it, and that really connects to how people consume media. Most people are consuming a fairly partisan media now, right? And or if they're not consuming a very strictly partisan media, they really don't have a varied media diet. So they're looking at kind of one or two things that pretty much is telling them the same kind of thing. If you look at a different media source, you could get a totally different impression about what's happening. So just in terms of like people remembering scandals, one of the things I find is that there's a lot of people who forget about scandals, period. I think like you said earlier, there's so much going on. Right. It's just impossible to keep track of it all, right? One strategy for politicians is just like flood the zone with stuff. And the more stuff that's happening, the more things you're going to miss just by nature. But that's one problem. The other problem is that even if you could see it all, it's framed for you in such a way that gives you the details about one particular scandal that involves an opponent, right? And that could sort of highlight the things that you think are bad about that and minimize the things about the politicians who are in your corner politically. So that difference in terms of how people consume the media is a big factor. clear. But I also want to talk about the way that politicians deal with this, right? So apologies is one thing. We don't see as many apologies as we used to, I have to say. We certainly have tracked this over time. But the other is that they like it. This is good for them in two ways. Number one, anger sells.
Oh, yeah.
We know that there's a lot of scholarship that suggests that if you rile up the base, people are more likely to split in a partisan fashion, which for elections is good, and they're more likely to vote, which if your elected official is perfect because now they're going to come vote for you. So keeping the base mad, keeping them angry is a good way to basically get reelected. So the way politicians do this is that they're confronted by scandal. They'll say something like, well, look, they're out to get me. Or really, they're out to get you. But what happens is that I'm in the way. I'm protecting you from this.
Yeah.
Keeps the base angry, keeps that divide clear, and it basically gets you out of a scandal and gets you reelected. So the mechanism is pretty clear. The other is that anger leads to donations. And this is the oddest thing, is that we've seen the spike in donations from politicians who were involved in scandals because it's something that riles up the small dollar base.
Right.
Democrats have been challenged because they're spending too much time trying to get $5 donations, right? Like this is sort of the joke. Like they want these small dollar donations. But this really does work. Those are the people who are consistent givers. And it's not like a lot every time, but it's a little bit over a long period, it really adds up. So what we've seen is that when there is this moment of the politician getting caught in scandal, they'll use this literally as a rallying moment. They'll use this as a fundraising opportunity. So that is another way that it creates this sort of perverse incentives for politicians to, frankly, get involved in scandal and to fight their way out of it by saying, look, you know, partisan-wise, they're the problem. They're fighting me. They're out to get me. And I'm the one who's standing up for you, sticking up for you, you know, in office.
Well, yeah, and clearly President Trump did that in a masterful way.
Yeah, truly, yeah.
Because every time that he got indicted, the flood of donations came in just like that.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So, yes, of course. So what you're saying is that as a rule of thumb, if you want to be a successful politician, get yourself a scandal.
Find a scandal. Find one that lets you be a champion, a fighter. People want to see that. And in the scandal, if you can make the case that you're the one who's basically protecting the system, then people, especially your base, likes that. Now, the other side, of course, hate it, right? They're not going to vote for you. But honestly, in a partisan world, the likelihood of that happening is pretty low. So there are just fewer of these sort of institutional guardrails that kind of limit what a politician might do or say. And so as a result, if the goal is really just to get reelected, the only thing that they can do, the smartest play, is just to kind of prime their base and they come at you. So
let me ask you a question. Okay, from a Machiavellian perspective.
Yes.
Does the mean justify the end? And especially thinking about what's going to be the outcome in terms of public policy. If it's going to be better, if it's going to be worse, if it's going to be non-existent. So what is the trade-off of not holding politicians or whatever it is accountable given a scandal? What is it going to happen in terms of public policy outcomes?
Yeah, that's a great question.
Of course.
And it's I would expect nothing less from you.
Thank you, sir.
Strong questions, big questions, important questions. And I think that it's funny because I think it's just the way that people are wired. It's a kind of tribalism that exists in politics. Clearly, we see that.
Lord of the Flies.
Yeah, truly. Yeah, and so like the implications are just that we're going to likely see this continued split, right? So people who are against a politician who's been involved in a scandal say, like, how on earth could somebody support that person? Well, this is why, because people divide into these kind of partisan tribes. What's funny is that it's not just politics, actually. There was a great piece that some colleagues of ours did on Deflategate. Remember Deflategate? When Tom Brady was in the Patriots were accused of deflating the football so that you could grip it better. In theory, you're able to pass it more effectively, and it just was, by NFL rules, illegal. And so the question was, what effect did this have on people's perceptions of the Patriots and of football? What the scholars who investigated this found was exactly like political scandals, that this was something that was totally divided by partisanship. And partisanship here isn't about Republican, Democrat. It's about Patriots fans, Steelers fans, Cowboys fans. If you're a Patriots fan, Who cares?
Right.
They didn't mind. If
Right.
you're a Steelers fan, it was the worst thing to happen to pro football,
Right.
since the laces out sort of scandal. So this is definitely like something that people are used to. What these scholars also found was that education mattered, that information mattered.
Right.
People who had more information generally about the scandal were more likely to think it was a problem. So again, that's another sort of solution to this. But to answer your question more directly, the real implication to scandals not mattering is that you essentially have less accountability, right? People are not willing to hold politicians accountable for the kind of actions that they take. So for instance, a person who gets accused of a certain kind of wrongdoing, maybe it's a malappropriation, maybe it's some kind of fiscal
Right.
irresponsibility, maybe it's just a personal issue. And granted, there are differences in terms of how we treat these things, but if we don't use that as something that helps to inform our understanding of what that politician is doing and who they are as a person, then it ceases to be an effective way for us to hold them accountable.
Right, but then you have another effect, and that effect is how does it work internally in the policy-making process,
Yeah.
right? So once you are tainted by a scandal, yes, you may get reelected, and your constituency is one thing,
Yeah.
but that affects your internal working relationship with others in terms of
Yeah.
you need to pass this legislation.
That's true.
Right? And we have seen in other places, for example, the Texas House, given current example, is like you become toxic.
Yes.
And
Yes.
again, it depends on the scandal, but
So
also
true.
on the other hand, it depends on the person that is committing the scandal, right?
Yeah.
So, if you're Donald Trump,
Yeah.
you can get away, as he has said it, right?
Yeah.
With murder in middle of Manhattan,
Right.
and nothing would happen.
No one is
Right.
going to hold you accountable.
Right. But if you're, I don't know, another average legislator,
Yeah.
you might get it. So
Yeah.
there is a lot of caveats and a lot of potential interactions
Yeah.
that create this thing even more and more complicated.
Yeah. I am actually of mind to say that scandals are good. Like, we need these things to tell us about the way that the kind of world works, right? They should be this accountability mechanism. And I think you're right that, we can hold politicians accountable for the actions that they take, and the way that they act and operate is probably a reflection of the way that they're making policy and how they're negotiating with colleagues, negotiating across the aisle or not, right? If you're someone who's not willing to, be kind of sympathetic, if you're not willing to, be expressive and to be apologetic, then the likelihood is that you're probably not a great partner for like a legislative outcome. So that definitely is a sort of signal that we should use. And as citizens, we should understand what that means. So I think scandals are actually good in that way. And the question is, can we remedy this? Is there any way in which we can sort of see that, people can be convinced that a scandal is a problem and that a politician caught in these kinds of episodes need to be held accountable? Is there any way that can work? Can we bring shame back? I guess maybe is one different way of putting it.
I don't know. I mean, I think the genie is out of the bottle, and it's very difficult to put it back.
Yeah.
And I think that generational speaking also, the kind of what matters to different generations is also important for how you define it.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
So for, young people, X, Y, or Z may be like a non-issue.
Yes.
And for older folks like you, might be another important issue.
If I wasn't so frail, I would shake my cane at you from old age. But I see what you mean. Actually, it's a great point because, look, scandals are culturally determined in some ways. I mean, you make a great point about the way that other countries handle these things. Like, that's something that, is on a scale, right? Like, some things maybe culturally aren't as problematic as they are here. People are more permissive about certain kinds of things than we are here. But you certainly are going to see a new brand of scandal come out, right? So, for instance, the digital world now has a footprint of a person that is beyond just kind of where things were. Like, for instance, the governor of Virginia got kind of snared in a scandal where he survived, but he had basically donned blackface when he was in medical school.
Right.
It's in a yearbook, right? And yearbooks, like are just really sort of minimal, right? There's not like just pictures of everything that happened. But now people have pictures of everything that happened, right? And there's a digital marker of like you making comments on social media, right? So for the kind of next generation of scandals, do you think that those are going to be things that people are more or less permissive of? So in the past, people forgive these scandals where they say, well, yeah, okay, that's something that, is no longer complicated, no longer problematic. But in the future, you have a tattoo on your face or you used illegal drugs in a place that was at that point not illegal, but now is legal. So how do you see the way that the kind of cultural shift is going to change the scandals in
I
this
think it's
country?
going to be very fluid and it's going to be given, the flavor of the day.
Yeah.
And that's going to depend on what is trending in social media, what is not trending, who's running for office, who's not running for office, and the overall context and the overall environment.
Yeah.
I think that it depends also on how people interpret it in terms of personal conditions, right?
Yeah.
If a scandal is something that aligns with something that you are suffering, experiencing, or whatnot, or you feel, basically grieved by that scandal, then your reaction is going to be something else.
Interesting, yeah.
If you're saying like, whatever, I don't care.
Yeah.
Like, let fly out, whatever. I have other things to worry about than whatever personal situation of this individual, mingling with these X, Y, or Z.
That's a great point. And as people become more kind of culturally attuned to what's going on, they may kind of minimize the way that is problematic. That's interesting. Yeah. One of the things I also find in my work is that civic education matters. The people who have more education, people who have more information about politics, those two things separate, does tend to minimize the people's desire for scandal. So it's called like Schadenfreude. It's a German term that basically means taking pride and pleasure in other people's misery, right? You want people to suffer because you like to see them, right?
Yeah.
This is like all of reality TV, right?
Right.
Don't you think? Like this is basically the reason people are watching this, because they love to watch other people like squirm. They love to watch them in misery.
True.
And so the one kind of common question that people ask on this is like, do you like it when opponents are caught in these kinds of scandals? And so people who are more likely to answer that are less likely to have more formal education and less likely to have more information. The people who have more information and more education are less likely to say they want that to happen. So in a way, we can kind of fix that, right? Civic education is something that we're woefully bad at in this country. We have to do better at it, right? The amount of time that we spend on STEM and on physical education is really important, but we cannot limit and we cannot look over the importance of having civic education as part of it. So that's one thing we can do. Another is have more friends. What I ask people is whether or not they have friends of the opposition party, right? How many friends of Democrats, Republicans you have? And the more friends that a person has, the more likely they are to say that scandals are bad, they're problematic. So they don't want to see their kind of putative political opponents caught in these scandals if they have people who they know who are kind of friendly with these politicians. So that can matter too.
Yeah, and the common denominator of those two potential solutions, my dear sir, is that they establish a threshold, right? They establish a societal threshold, whether it's through personal relationships or through education, that allows people to have a floor of saying, this is good, this is bad.
Yeah.
That, with social media or lack of civic education, we don't have.
Social media is a big factor too. People who are more likely to use social media are more likely to say they want to see politicians caught up in this. And there is a kind of selection effect there, right? Where people who are trolling social media all the time want to see that fight. They want to see like the memes where JD Vance's head is really big and looks like a big garbage pail kid. You know what I mean? But that's a problem, right? And the good news is, like I said, that can be kind of minimized at least. The other is that it's certainly the case that the parties can serve as guardrails for this. They do a lot of the kind of culling of the candidates, and so they could do a much better job at basically making sure that the politicians they put up are less likely to have these kinds of scandalous issues. If that's possible, then they can at least weed out some opportunities for people to, present their mischief as being a plus, which only erodes people's faith in democracy. The other is that we know too that certain kinds of laws will limit scandal. So disclosure laws are a big factor at the state level in terms of limiting the amount of scandals that happen. The more of those there are, like disclosing gifts, disclosing how much income you have, spouse income, like there's a range of these different laws. The more of these there are at the local level, the more likely it is that scandals are reduced. So good government matters here. And I think that's another kind of factor we can use to basically try to limit when these things pop up.
Yeah, and for example, the Texas legislature has been very concerned about that. Some of the bills that we discussed last week, where these make Texas great, healthy again. And Sarah Colhorse has in her bill, this implicated that if you want to be member of this nutrition commission, you cannot own more than 3% a stake on things related to nutrition. I'm like, exactly.
That's perfect.
This is the very own definition of avoiding conflict of interest and therefore avoiding scandals.
So true, yeah. At the end of the day, honestly, it's still the people that have to be the voice that is reasonable on this. And that's hard because,
okay.
I mean,
sure.
They're the ones who are the ultimate arbiters of this, right? Politicians won't step aside. Parties won't police them. The media can only cover so much. Like, we've left all of the institutional capacity that we have. And now it's the voter's choice. They have to make a choice. Like, do I trust this person to do a good job? And I'm not saying that, a person who's involved in scandal can't do a good job, but the fact is that we are the last line of defense here. So people have to be aware and cognizant of just what that means. Like, what do these things actually mean in the context of how people govern? So a careful, I think, sober assessment of that is really what people should do.
Well, not only an assessment, but also taking it seriously. It's our civic responsibility to help politicians, because that is the basis of a represented democracy, to hold these politicians accountable.
So true, yeah.
But that's going to be something that we're definitely going to discuss in the next couple of weeks. I'm Jeronimo Cortina.
And I'm Brandon Rottinghaus. Thanks for joining us.